Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner, and thanks once again for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Now, last week we wrapped up a four-part series that we did on the IEC 61131 programming environment in Cscape. If you haven't checked that out yet, I would highly encourage you to do so. At Horner, we like to provide our customers with lots of options, and one of the ways we do that is by the options you have when it comes to programming your OCS All-in-one Controller to program your application. So IEC is a terrific option, as is Advanced Ladder for the traditionalists out there. But for the next couple of weeks, we're going to change gears a bit, and we've got a couple of hardware-related topics. Here's today's topic, where we're going to help you answer the question, should you install your OCS outside or inside the control panel? Just as I mentioned with providing our customers with choices when it comes to programming languages, we like to provide choices when it comes to installation. Flexibility is what we like to promote. So you do have the option in a lot of cases of how and where to install your OCS All-in-one Controller. And we're going to break that down for you today. So here's how we're going to break down that topic. All right, we're going to start, of course, talking about the contrast between when you might mount your OCS controller through the enclosure door, like a traditional operator interface, and when you might put it inside the control panel, maybe closer to the way a PLC is traditionally applied. We're also going to talk about some environmental considerations that might come into play. We'll talk about the standard OCS ratings, and we'll talk about what you can do to mitigate some of the elements issues that can come up from time to time. If you've got an OCS installed kind of out in the elements of temperature, UV, sunlight, condensation, all things you need to consider if you're going to be installing your OCS outdoors, for instance. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Let's start by talking about mounting the OCS controller the traditional way on the door. So why would you do that? Well, of course, through the door is the traditional mounting location for operator interfaces for machine control. And the OCS, of course, has a built-in operator interface. So wiring that and putting that on the door makes a lot of sense. Now, some folks think of the built-in I/O, this in the back of every OCS or available for the back of every OCS. They think of that as a negative because they're concerned about the amount of wiring that may be running along the hinge. But I like to think of it as a real positive because it gives you the flexibility to use some of that built-in I/O for the operators that may be present on the door itself, the push buttons, the pilot lights, etc. And now those wires, which normally would be run along the hinge to the backplate, those particular wires can go right to the I/O on the back of the OCS. And that's just a real clean way to install and design your system. Also, with the OCS mounted on the door, when you open up that control cabinet, now your service personnel have complete open access to all the wiring and all the cabling on the back of the OCS. All the I/O wiring, all the networking, all that is out and available and easy to work on. They're not bending over into some tight quarters on the backplate where probably more devices were crammed into a small amount of space. So it can be really convenient for your service folks to have that OCS mounted on the door. Now, another advantage to having it on the door is that you also get better access to the drives that are located on the controller. We're talking about micro SD is easily available when you open up that door of the control enclosure because that slot is handy and accessible right where you want it. Also, if you're talking about USB, that's also easily accessible. And with USB, you have the option of also using an IP-rated extension cable that can even prevent you from having to open up the door at all in order to plug in and out your USB drive. And the same thing can be done with mini USB as well for programming. Yeah, you can open up the control enclosure and plug in that programming port through the USB mini B connection, or you can use one of those IP-rated extension cables and do it without even opening up the enclosure. Now, what's the process involved when you're installing the OCS on the enclosure door? Well, it's pretty straightforward. It's like we've traditionally installed, or customers have traditionally installed operator interfaces. You start with the appropriate cutout. And it's always best, if you can, to order your enclosure pre-laser cut with the appropriate cutout. If not, if you're using one of the OCS models that uses a standard cutout, you might be able to use a quartered in hole punch, for instance, in order to make that cutout. Or there's other ways to get that cutout sized appropriately with the appropriate amount of tolerance, if you will. Okay, but once you've got that cutout squared away, then you're basically going to remove all the removable terminal blocks from your OCS, slide it through the cutout from the outside, and then you'll start clamping it down by affixing those clamps that come in your install package to the door. Now, every once in a while, I'll run into a new customer that's having a little bit of challenges, if you will, when they start using the clamps. And one thing I hear from time to time is they'll say, well, that clamp is kind of walking away from the OCS. It's not perfectly square as I'm tightening it down. So a little hint that I give those folks, and I'll give you now, is that you can use a small little square of masking tape on the smooth surface on the inside of the door at the point where that fastener for the clamp makes contact with the door. And just that little bit of friction will help discourage that clamp fastener from walking away from the OCS. Generally something that you don't need to do, but it's a little hint I like to give folks. Okay, now when it comes to the actual cutout size itself, at Horner we actually do our best to limit the number of cutout options available, because the more models that'll work with the same cutout, the more options our customers have in terms of using the same panel cutout for multiple OCS models. So that center cutout in that diagram there on the screen, that one is actually compatible with a whole variety of different models. It's the traditional size for a 5.7-inch touchscreen from back in the day, but we kept that same cutout size, and it's now that cutout can be used with the EXL6, the EXLW, the Prime equivalent of those products, along with the Micro OCS X7 and X10, and even the XL Plus will all fit through that what we call universal cutout hole to give customers more options to change out the OCS to a different model to offer their customers flexibility without having to change the cutout size. Okay, now let's switch around to talk about when would you mount your OCS controller on the backplate, inside the panel on the backplate. Well, let's talk about why, first of all. Well, you'd say why? Because the OCS is an excellent PLC. Now, in some applications, they don't require a local operator interface. Maybe it's a SCADA only remote access type scenario, and there's just no need for a local operator interface. But customers will start looking, they'll start saying, well, I just need to find a control that doesn't have a local screen. But the reality is having that extra screen there does not make the OCS a worse PLC. It actually makes it better because you can not only mount that inside the enclosure like a traditional PLC, but you can also utilize the screen graphics for all kinds of local diagnostics. So when your service personnel are inside that panel and doing some machine troubleshooting, they've got all those graphics available to them to give them the status they need to do a much better job of that. Also, in remote applications where you don't have an operator around, having that unit inside the enclosure also keeps the OCS away from harsh environments. So that's another good reason to mount the OCS on the backplate inside the enclosure. Now, another reason to do it is because the XLEE, the XLTE, even the XL4 are really excellent remote I/O blocks as well, especially when you're talking about things like Ethernet IP, Modbus TCP, etc. You know, who isn't having trouble right now getting Ethernet IP remote I/O for their control systems? You know, that's a big issue these days. And we've done several sessions where we've specifically showed all the steps with example programs to take an XLE, for instance, and turn it into an Ethernet IP remote I/O block. And in that scenario, you very much might choose to mount that XLE in the panel on the backplate for that application. Don't forget to check out our website with all the example programs we have already created for you for that application. Okay, now let's specifically talk about which models are easier to mount on the backplate than others. Well, let's start with the quarter DIN controllers. Quarter DIN is a standard cutout size, and we have really four these days, four different products that utilize that same cutout. We have the XLE, the XLT, the XL4, and the XL4 Prime. All those products fit through a nice quarter DIN cutout, and they also include, built into the back cover, they include a DIN rail clamping system that works terrific for very confidently affixing that product to DIN rail. So it passes all the vibration tests when you affix one of those products on DIN rail using that clamping system. Now, the larger models, like the 6-inch and 7-inch and even the 10-inch, also use that same back plastic so that DIN rail clamp is still there, but really you should only use that maybe on the bench or in a lab environment when you're testing. It should not be for permanent installation. But if you're using one of those quarter DIN models, then certainly by all means that clamping system works really well. Now some people will say, you know, I would really love to use the micro OCS because of its price and functionality. I'd like to use that inside the panel now and then. Well, we've listened to you and we now have a new accessory that allows you to mount the X2, the X4, and the X5 inside a control panel. Not on DIN rail specifically, but you can still panel mount the X2, X4, or X5 to this accessory, and then that accessory mounts via a screw mount approach to the backplate. It gives you full access to all the wiring. It's a really nice solution. You can see the part number there on the screen and a list price of only $99. So if you are one of those folks who'd really like to use a micro OCS on one of those applications where it's got to be used inside the control panel, this accessory is for you. Now some folks, especially when they're using our quarter DIN controllers like the XLE, XLTE, and XL4, when they're using those on the DIN rail, they like to explore what are additional removable terminal block options available that might make it easier for me to access my wiring or individual wires while it's mounted in that fashion. Well, we do have a solution that's available as an accessory, and that are some spring clamp terminal blocks that are available as a set for the different I/O models that you can use so that you can have a little bit better access to individual wires while your OCS is mounted on DIN rail. Now, it's still not ideal, but it does improve the situation a bit. But for most customers, they're basically just going to disconnect the plug to work on individual wires, whether they're using the stock terminal plugs or they're using these as well. All right, now that we've talked about some considerations in terms of where you mount it, let's also start talking about some environmental considerations for your application. And we're going to start by talking about the standard environmental specs for OCS. So all those models on the screen, which for all intents and purposes is just about every OCS we sell today, there's the standard specifications that are available for OCS. Now you'll notice a temperature range operating wise from -10 to +60 C, and relative humidity with a nice wide range of 5 to 95%, but non-condensing. Okay, and all of the OCS models have a UL type rating that includes 1, 12, 12K, 13, 4, and 4X, and you can see the rest of the ratings as well. Now for those with lower temperature applications, you know, maybe it's going to get well below -10 for instance, we also offer several models available with a integral 24 volt DC heater. Now that heater, again, powered from 24 volts DC, it has uses an internal thermostat, so there's no extra control or anything that is required. There's also no AC power that has to be run to the system or anything like that. But anyway, with those models, you can use those all the way down to -40 C, which happens to be the same as -40 F, because that's the crossover point for the two ranges. So if you do have a colder temperature application, you might want to consider the -22 part number extension, which will give you this extra operating range without losing any of your UL approvals. Okay, now let's start talking about specific elements that can be a challenge, and we're going to start with temperature. Keep in mind, the OCS ratings are conservative for temperature and for other elements as well, but you shouldn't just ignore them. And let's talk a little bit about some of the components that are probably more impacted by temperature than others. Let's start with batteries. This isn't unique to Horner, this is just unique to batteries, right? With batteries, if they're used at extreme temperatures, their lifetime is reduced. And that's true whether it's a rechargeable battery or a traditional coin cell, for instance. Also, if you are using a rechargeable battery and you're at extreme temperature ranges of low or high, you're really restricting where your batteries are able to recharge, because the temperature has to be kind of in the middle for them to be able to recharge. Another component that's impacted by temperature extremes are touchscreens. So the screen contrast can get thrown off in very hot or very cold temperatures. In hot temperatures especially, the screen can get kind of dark. In cold temperatures, the screen can get really sluggish. And then when you're talking about touch sensitivity from a touch standpoint, that also can be impacted by temperature by reducing, in a lot of cases, the sensitivity of the touchscreen. So again, even though the OCS has very robust conservative ratings, don't ignore the temperature ratings because some of the components at some point are going to be affected. Okay, another area that people sometimes don't think about when it comes to the environment is condensation. You want to be aware of condensation for sure. Sudden temperature swings can cause condensation inside your control cabinet, which can cause problems with electrical devices as well as electronic devices like OCS products. When you have condensation, you're absolutely risking damage to those electronics from short circuits or corrosion, all those sorts of things, okay? Now, the good news is there are some condensation fighters. One thing you can do is you can control the temperature inside your enclosure through heating or cooling or both. Another thing you can do that's really inexpensive is you can use these Gore-Tex breather valves that can help equalize the airflow between the inside and the outside of the enclosure. And that's good for equalizing pressure as well as air temperature, etc. And these breather valves are not expensive and they're really easy to install. So don't forget about those. Do some research on those if you've got an application where condensation could be an issue because of temperature swings, etc., and utilize those breather valves. Another thing you have to look out for when you're talking about being exposed to the environments is UV. And UV, which obviously comes from the sun, it can really damage industrial rated products. It can cause plastic housings to become brittle and break. It can take clear overlays that are used on top of screens and over time make them cloud over and also become brittle and lose their seal. It's a real problem for industrial products used when they're exposed to UV. Now at Horner, we do our part. We spend more money on UV stable plastic than our competition does. You know, we don't use the cheapest possible plastic. Our plastic housings are made from UV stable material. Also, our overlays are made from UV stable material. So you won't see them cloud up. You won't see them crack because of exposure to UV, okay? But be aware when you're using industrial devices and they're exposed to UV, you can have some issues. Now let's talk about sunlight. Okay, there's a lot of problems sunlight can have. One problem with an industrial application located outdoors especially is it can cause the rapid heating of an enclosure, which is one of the causes or one of the enablers of condensation. It can also cause the superheating of air if you're using one of those kind of screen protective windows that leaves a pocket of air between the protective window and the outside of the control enclosure. If you're using one of those products and there's a pocket of air in there and you're not properly venting it, the sun can superheat that air with the greenhouse effect, and the next thing you know, you're melting plastic, it's so hot. So that can be a really big problem. Also, UV damage can occur over time, as we just talked about. And another big problem can be the inability to read the screen when you have direct sunlight glaring on the screen. Now, luckily, there are some things that you can do. There are some solutions out there. One thing that's a relatively simple solution, but you need to think ahead, is you might be able to orient the control cabinet in space with the sun direction in mind. Okay, so as opposed to pointing it straight south, you might want to have in a much more advantageous direction if you have some flexibility. Also, if you are using one of those screen windows over the outside to protect your controller, to protect your screen, make sure you've properly vented it. And if you've got one of those locations that's a problem location because of glare, or maybe you just want to provide extra protection, a folding cover like I'm showing there on the screen is a really nice option. It's folded down normally, which provides total protection against UV and the sun's rays. And then when you need to use the screen, you can fold it out and it becomes a hood that can protect against glare so you can see the screen better. So it's definitely something I would explore if I was installing an OCS or any other operator interface outdoors. Another solution in general that people should really consider, not necessarily just for outdoor applications, and that is the use of what's called an interior door or a swing panel in your control enclosure. Now, this is often a really good solution for those applications where the environment is severe. It doesn't have to be outdoors, but it's a severe environment, and you don't have to have the operator in front of that screen all day long. They just need to use it occasionally. So with this scenario, having this approach of an interior door or an interior swing panel, the OCS of any size can be mounted like it traditionally is, just on the swing panel or interior door itself instead of the exterior door. Now, whenever the service person needs to utilize that particular screen, they open up the external door and that OCS is standing there right there, nicely installed, ready to work on. They can then open up the swing panel and they have complete access to all the wiring. It's just a really nice solution that you should consider on a variety of different applications. Okay, so that's really the material that I wanted to cover with you today. Today wasn't a demonstration, a heavy type session. It's really all about how can I install my OCS, what are my options, and then what are some of the environmental considerations I might have, especially if I'm going to be installing in a really rugged environment. So what are the big picture items from today? Well, there's a variety of considerations, of course, when you're deciding how and where to install your OCS. Some models, especially the quarter DIN models, give you extra flexibility for mounting either on the outside of the enclosure or on the backplate. Paying attention to your environment when you're planning your application is really important for long-term success of the control system. And don't forget about some solutions like the Gore-Tex vents, the swing panels, the folding sunshades. These are all solutions that you can use, tools in your toolbox, to end up with a much better result even in tough conditions. Okay, before I sign off, I want to remind you that we're here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, whether we're totally live like today or whether we're pre-recorded. And even when we're pre-recorded, we're always standing by answering your questions live from the chat section. And then if you're watching on replay, you can always give us your comments and your questions in the comment section, and we'll get those responded to just as quickly as we can. Now, next week, we think we've got a fun topic. It's another hardware-related topic, and that is using a 5G cellular modem with a Horner OCS. And we should have a little more demonstrations for you next week. Okay, before I sign off, I do want to remind you, if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to our channel. It doesn't cost anything. We won't bug you with an excess number of notifications, but every time we go live or every time we post a new video, if you choose notifications, you'll be notified and you'll be able to join us if your schedule allows. Okay, until next week, let's all get out there and do some good, and let's enjoy the rest of this summer, because in the Northern Hemisphere, it's not going to be around for long. Take care, everybody.